Remember back when you were a kid and you would be outside chilling with your friends, hanging out, having a good time, and the next thing you guys might be doing something a little suspect. When all of a sudden somebody spots you doing it, this might be what the scene looked like afterwards, where everybody took off in their own direction, trying to get home as fast as they could before they got caught. Fortunately, in this situation, somebody did get caught. These images were recently released by the Coast Guard and as part of their narcotic sting operations they're conducting in the Pacific. I often wondered what happens when they catch these vessels out in the middle of the ocean, what happens to the boat after they confiscate the cargo and the people who were on the vessel. Apparently, this is one such situation where they wound up scuttling the boats. Just one of the wild and crazy things we will witness in this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to the Maldives, where this was the scene just a little over a week and a half ago, when a ferry speedboat that was carrying 48 passengers wound up sinking off the coast of the Maldives after it encountered rough weather. It began to take waves over the bow and the gunnels, eventually flooding the vessel and finally flooding the engine compartment, rendering the vessel without power. Prior to that, the vessel was trying to make a run to get as close to land as possible before noting they would have to abandon ship. They quickly got all 48 people on board the vessel ready to go by getting them all life jackets. They did alert local authorities to the situation. The local authorities did release a report stating that at 7:57 in the morning they had received a report from the launch Havan that it was sinking en route to Malay. Local authorities quickly launched rescue vessels to head toward the area. It did not take long before the vessel had taken on so much water they had no choice but to abandon ship, as seen in the images here. Once the local authorities arrived on the scene, they noted 48 people bobbing in the water with life jackets on. Surprisingly, in this situation, all 48 people who were on board the ferry were rescued without injury. An investigation has been launched to try and determine the actual cause of the sinking. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Brazil, where this was the scene just this past week, when a large Brazilian-flagged oil tanker, Alvo Biloc, wound up losing control while maneuvering in the port of Santos and wound up crashing into a pier and 3 Brazilian naval boats that happened to be docked at the pier at the time of the incident. If you look at the top of the screen, you can see the tanker actually approaching the dock at this time. The tanker was in a process of actually switching docks when all of a sudden a mechanical failure wound up limiting the rudder control and the vessel was no longer able to steer, forcing them to wind up crashing into the pier as seen here. But also you can tell they are still under power at this point as you see the bow of the tanker start to push into the naval vessel's scene, and here we start to see the Navy start to scramble off the boats. The tanker happened to be carrying approximately 13,000 gallons of fuel at the time of the incident. Local port officials did confirm that the tanker first struck the pier before colliding with a Navy patrol boat, which then was pushed back and forced to collide into 2 other patrol boats that were moored off its stern. Earlier reports that have been released claim that the tanker only suffered superficial damage during the incident. Unfortunately, none of the fuel it was carrying wound up leaking during the incident as well. The Brazilian Navy has not released reports yet as to the full damage to the pier nor the vessels that were involved. They have claimed, though, no life-threatening injuries were sustained during the incident, but this footage has leaked from the tanker. It's a little odd. The tanker was going straight and all of a sudden just bears to the starboard side, heading directly into the pier, indicating that something definitely went wrong. Kind of reminds me of that scene from Caddyshack for some reason.
I'll move over, Swanson, I'm driving. Back!
Now, typically I wouldn't joke about accidents like that, but since everybody was okay, I figured I could get away with one, but I'm sure if I took it too far, you guys will let me know in the comments. Speaking of going too far, that's going to bring us to our next story to make the boating news this week, and this happened just a few days ago. Here we see a military vessel returning into port, but also returning a 61-year-old Peruvian fisherman who had been rescued from sea after being adrift for over 95 days off the coast of Ecuador. The man seen in the images here hugging his relative is 61-year-old Maximo Napa. And on December 7th, he loaded his vessel with 2 weeks worth of supplies as he planned to go out and enjoy a 2-week fishing trip. Unfortunately for Maximo, he departed from his hometown in Peru, and only a few days into that trip wound up encountering a severe storm which wound up rendering his engine useless, and all of a sudden he found himself without power and adrift out at sea. Unfortunately for Maximo, he did not have an EPIRB or any type of satellite communication device on board the vessel with him at the time, so he had no way to alert his family or authorities of his situation. Unfortunately, he'd also only planned for a 2-week trip, so he quickly ran out of food or water. He claimed that he ate insects, birds, and even a turtle in order to keep going and relied solely on rainwater for his drinking water supply. Fortunately for Maximo, almost 95 days after going adrift, on March 11th, an Ecuadorian fishing patrol boat wound up finding Maximo approximately 600 nautical miles off the coast of Ecuador, almost 1,000 nautical miles from where he was supposed to be. When the crews found him, they claimed Maximo was severely dehydrated and in critical condition. They brought him back to shore and placed him into hospital care to help him recover. After being in the hospital for 3 days, he finally caught a flight back to his home country of Peru and was reunited with his family. Speaking of being reunited with their family, that's going to bring us to our next story, which is going to take us over to Florida, where this was the scene just a couple of days ago, when 2 16-year-old girls went missing while paddleboarding off the coast of Florida just this week. The Levy County Sheriff's deputies say the search began for Avery Bryan and Eva Aponte after the two departed on a paddleboard around 4 p.m. Monday, paddling towards Cedar Key, but never actually returning home that evening. Local authorities and crews were alerted to the situation, and rescue operations were set underway, including many volunteer vessels as well. Unfortunately, with the onset of nightfall coming when the rescue operations were launched, the girls wound up not being found during the evening, but fortunately for them, they were found the very next morning, approximately 14 miles from where they were originally supposed to be. Local authorities were interviewed on the scene, and this is what they had to say about the situation.
My understanding earlier this morning, one of our volunteers located them kind of up against the marsh grass south of Porpoise Point, which is down near Yankeetown. So to give our viewers a little idea, from Cedar Key to the area where they were found is about 14 nautical miles. That's a long way. Very long, cold night for those young ladies last night.
But fortunately, the two ladies were brought home with only minor scrapes and cuts, a good end to that story, which is going to bring us to our next story, which is going to take us over to Oregon, where this was the scene just about a week ago, when a 76-year-old man had to be rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard at the base of the Youngs Bay Bridge near the mouth of the Columbia River in Astoria, Oregon. The U.S. Coast Guard had received a request from assistance from the Astoria Police Department about the man being in the water. The Astoria Police Department took a line and a life jacket and lowered it down to the 76-year-old so he could place it on while they awaited the Coast Guard's arrival to get the man pulled out of the water. Fortunately, the Coast Guard actually already had a helicopter in the air at the time of the incident, and took them less than 30 minutes to get to the scene and get the gentleman pulled from the water and placed on the bridge where local authorities could take him to the local hospital to get the treatment that he needed. Where the strange twist really comes in on this story is once local authorities get a hold of the man and they are able to actually identify him, they discover he is a 76-year-old man who had been missing and endangered from Northern Virginia, which is quite the haul from Oregon. And at this time, they've not released any information as to what brought up that status, but fortunately, he was able to get set on the bridge and everything wound up okay. Thanks for watching, crew. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram and let us know, and you might see your stories over here. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button.